The Devil's Pact. It started on a cold, rainy night, much like any other in the town of Black Hollow. The wind howled through the narrow streets, and the rain fell in sheets, soaking the earth and everything in it. Most of the townspeople were indoors, warmed by their fires and sheltered from the storm. But one man, Henry Barnes, was not so lucky. Henry was desperate. He was an ordinary man, living an ordinary life. He had a modest home, a wife, and a young daughter he adored. But things had not been going well for him lately. His business was failing, his debts were mounting, and he could feel his family slipping away from him. His wife, Claire, had stopped looking at him the way she used to. The worry in her eyes had replaced the love, and their once warm, loving home had grown cold with the weight of their struggles. That night, Henry had been walking the streets aimlessly, trying to escape the crushing sense of failure that gnawed at his insides. The rain had soaked through his coat, chilling him to the bone, but he didn't care. His thoughts were elsewhere, spiraling into a dark pit of despair. Then he saw it, a flicker of light down a narrow alley, almost imperceptible in the storm. Henry paused, squinting through the rain. The light was faint, barely more than a candle's glow, but it was enough to catch his attention. He wasn't sure why, but something compelled him to follow it. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was something more, a sense that this light held the answers to his troubles. As he approached the alley, the light grew brighter, casting eerie shadows on the brick walls. The air seemed to hum with energy, and Henry's heart pounded in his chest. He turned the corner and found himself standing in front of an old, weathered door. It looked out of place, ancient and heavy, with strange symbols carved into the wood. Without thinking, Henry reached for the door handle. It was cold, almost painfully so, but he turned it anyway. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room inside. A man sat at a small table, illuminated by a single candle. He was dressed in a sharp, black suit, his features sharp and angular, and his eyes. His eyes were like nothing Henry had ever seen. They were dark, endless voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. The man smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that sent a shiver down Henry's spine. "Come in," the man said, his voice smooth and velvety. "I've been expecting you." Henry hesitated for a moment, but something about the man's presence drew him in. He stepped inside, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. The room was small and sparse, with no windows and only the table and two chairs. "Who are you?" Henry asked, his voice trembling slightly. The man's smile widened. "I go by many names, but you may call me Lucien." Henry's stomach churned at the name. There was something wrong about it, something that gnawed at the edges of his mind. But before he could dwell on it, Lucien gestured to the chair opposite him. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." Against his better judgment, Henry sat down. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on him. Lucien's gaze never left him, those dark eyes boring into his soul. "You're in quite the predicament, aren't you, Henry?" Lucien said, his tone almost sympathetic. Henry blinked, startled. "How? How do you know my name?" Lucien chuckled softly. "I know many things, Henry. I know about your failing business, your mounting debts. I know about your wife, Claire, and your daughter, Emily. I know how you've been struggling, how you've been feeling. Desperate." Henry's heart skipped a beat. This man, this stranger, knew everything. It was impossible, but there he was, laying bare all of Henry's fears and failures. "Who are you?" Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. Lucian leaned forward, his grin widening. "I am someone who can help you, Henry. I can make all your problems disappear. Your business will thrive, your debts will vanish, and your family. Well, they will never have to worry again." Henry's breath caught in his throat. It sounded too good to be true, like a dream. But there was a catch. There always was. "What's the price?" Henry asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lucian's eyes gleamed with a predatory glint. "Ah, you are a sharp one. Yes, there is a price. But I assure you, it's nothing too unreasonable." Henry's stomach churned. He knew, deep down, that whatever Lucian was offering, it came with a terrible cost. But he was desperate. He couldn't lose his family, his home. He couldn't bear the thought of his wife and daughter living in poverty because of his failures. "What do you want from me?" Henry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucian leaned back in his chair, his smile fading. "Your soul." The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavy with the weight of Lucian's words. Henry's heart raced, his mind reeling. His soul? It sounded absurd, like something out of a story. But the way Lucian said it, with such calm certainty, sent a chill down his spine. "My soul?" Henry repeated, his voice trembling. Lucian nodded. "In exchange, you will have everything you desire. Wealth, success, happiness. Your family will never want for anything. All I ask is that, when your time comes, your soul belongs to me." Henry stared at the man in disbelief. It was madness, pure madness. But then he thought about Claire, about Emily. He thought about the mounting bills, the creditors knocking on their door. He thought about the fear in his wife's eyes, the uncertainty in his daughter's voice. He couldn't let them suffer because of him. "I'll do it," Henry said, his voice barely audible. Lucian's smile returned, wider and more sinister than before. "Excellent. Then we have an agreement." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small piece of parchment and a quill. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and covered in strange symbols that Henry couldn't decipher. "Sign here," Lucian said, sliding the parchment across the table. Henry's hand shook as he picked up the quill. His mind screamed at him to stop, to walk away, but he couldn't. He had no choice. He pressed the quill to the parchment and signed his name. The moment the ink dried, the room seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to writhe and twist. Lucian's smile grew impossibly wide, his eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. "Your wish is granted," Lucian said, his voice low and dangerous. "But remember, Henry, when the time comes, I will collect." With that, Lucian vanished, the room plunging into darkness. At first, everything seemed perfect. Henry's business flourished almost overnight. New clients poured in, money flowed freely, and his debts disappeared. Claire and Emily were happier than ever, their home filled with laughter and joy once more. For the first time in months, Henry felt like he had control over his life again. But then, the dreams began. At first, they were small things. Shadows creeping at the edge of his vision, strange whispers in the dead of night. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart racing, but he brushed it off as stress. But the dreams grew darker, more vivid. He saw Lucien's face in every shadow, heard his voice in every whisper. And then the blood started. It began with small, unexplainable stains on his clothes, on the walls of his house. Red smears that appeared overnight, impossible to clean no matter how hard he tried. Claire didn't seem to notice, and Emily never mentioned it, but Henry couldn't escape it. The blood followed him everywhere, on his hands, his clothes, his reflection. It wasn't long before the shadows became real. They slithered out from under his bed, from the corners of the room, their dark tendrils reaching for him in the night. He could feel their cold touch on his skin, hear their low, menacing whispers in his ears. Lucien's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him of the deal he had made, the deal that could not be undone. "I will collect." The words haunted him, consuming his every waking moment. He tried to run, tried to escape the fate he had sealed, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows followed him, the bloodstains multiplied, and Lucien's voice grew louder and more menacing with each passing day. And then, one night, it happened. Henry awoke to find himself standing in the middle of his living room, his hands drenched in blood. Claire lay on the floor in front of him, her lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. Emily's cries echoed through the house, her small voice filled with terror. He had done it. He had killed them. The realization hit him like a freight train, and Henry collapsed to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. He had lost everything, his family, his home, his soul, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Lucien appeared before him, his dark eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Your time has come, Henry," he said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "I have come to collect." Henry screamed, but it was too late. The shadows closed in around him, their cold hands pulling him into the darkness. And in that darkness, Henry knew he would remain, forever trapped in the devil's grasp.